You know, it's fine to bring in the user and manage the login, register, and logout all right within this app, but I think it would actually make more sense to put that code inside of this auth context module and make a special component that's just responsible for getting the user's information and exposing mechanisms for interacting with that. So what I'm going to do is actually copy and paste most of this stuff inside the auth context module right here. And then our app can be super simple. So let's remove all of the stuff that's related to authentication from our app. So we'll get rid of get user, we'll get rid of getting that user's information, and even what we render based on that user's information. And we'll just assume that we can use the use auth hook to get the user. And so we won't be responsible for rendering the auth context provider. Instead, we'll just render the right part of our app based on whether we have the user. So then we can get rid of all of this stuff right here, and we'll just import use auth from context auth context. And it looks like we're also going to still need the browser router as router from React router DOM. So this is much simpler than before, and now we're able to focus our efforts on this auth context right here. So instead of app, this is going to be our auth provider. So this is the component that renders our auth context. And then from here, we don't want to be in charge of what we render based on the user state. Instead, we're just going to be in charge of rendering the auth context provider. And then inside of the auth context provider, we'll just render the children. And we'll accept those children as props. And we are going to need to rename this. We'll just call this value, so we're not overriding those props there. And then we're going to need to pass the value here. And actually, let's just spread the props that we get to this component and make it a one-liner. And we no longer need to export the auth context either. We'll just export the auth provider. And when people want to use the auth context provider, then they'll use our auth provider component. And when they want to consume that context value, then they use the use auth custom hook. So we no longer need to expose our auth context here. All right, let's clean up a few other things here. We're going to need to put this up here at the very top. Let's move this down below our imports. We've got 2 React imports here. And then we were importing the auth context. We no longer need to do that. And then we don't need that browser router. We don't need the authenticated app or the unauthenticated app because we're not responsible for rendering those. We're just responsible for the authentication portion. And then because we're in the source context directory, we can't access these here, but we can go up a directory like this, or we can use the tooling configuration that we've got and instead just import it like so. All right, and let's see what else we need to do here. So instead of the auth context provider now, we can give this error message something more helpful with within an auth provider. Great, so let's take a look. And oh, there's that error message helping us out. We're not rendering the auth provider anywhere. Because before we were rendering that auth context provider right here, we're no longer doing that. So instead, we're actually going to render it at the root of our app. So let's import that right here. Auth provider from context auth context. And then we'll render that around our app right there. And things are looking pretty great. So what we've accomplished here is we drastically simplified our app component to only care about rendering the right thing based on whether the user is authenticated. And we moved all of that logic to the auth context to a new auth provider, which manages getting the user, as well as the functions that we have for interacting with that user's logged in state, as well as what we render when we're loading or idle, or in an error state. And finally, when we're successful at determining the authenticated state of the user. And then we take this auth provider and we render it around the root of our application so that every component of our application has access to that auth provider's context value. And this means that our auth context is no longer accessible by any module other than this one because we no longer need to export it. One last tip I want to give you is what our auth context looks like in the DevTools. So if we open this up, go to our components here, we'll see we have the auth provider, and then we see this generic context.provider. And if we look at that, we'll see that our value includes the login and logout and the user. But this context.provider display name could be drastically improved. And so what I'm going to do is add a .display name to this, and we'll call it auth context. And now we'll see that we have our auth provider and then auth context.provider, which makes our DevTools much more helpful, and it will make the profiler easier to understand as well. Just a fun little tip for how you can give your auth context a better display name.